The Cowboy and the Comanche, a winter of solitude and hope. Jacob rode slowly across the frozen plains, his horse's hooves crunching against the thin layer of snow that covered the land. The winter had come early this year, and the wind carried a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest layers of his coat. Jacob had lived on this ranch for nearly 10 years, ever since his father had passed, leaving him to care for the sprawling property alone. He had grown accustomed to the silence that stretched across the vast fields, the sound of the wind and the occasional call of a crow being the only company he had. Yet this solitude, which he once cherished, had begun to feel heavier in the last weeks. The snow seemed endless, and the nights were long and dark, filled with the quiet echo of his own thoughts. As he guided his horse toward a distant fence line, Jacob noticed something unusual. Among the tracks in the snow were footprints that did not belong to him or any of the ranch hands who had visited earlier in the season. They were small and delicate, and the way they pressed into the snow suggested that whoever had passed through was moving cautiously, almost as if afraid of being seen. Jacob's hand instinctively went to the rifle slung across his shoulder, though he did not raise it. Instead, he slowed his horse and studied the tracks. They led toward a small copse of trees that offered the only shelter in miles of open plains. He dismounted carefully, feeling the snow crunch beneath his boots. The footprints stopped at a small clearing where he saw a faint wisp of smoke curling upward. Someone had built a fire, but it was low, and the smoke was thin, suggesting it had been lit some hours ago. Jacob's heart quickened, and he felt a mixture of curiosity and concern. It was unusual for anyone to travel alone in these conditions, especially in such a remote area. He approached slowly, calling out in a low voice. "Hello? Is someone there?" At first, there was no reply. Then a movement near the trees caught his eye. A figure stumbled toward the edge of the clearing, half covered in snow, shivering and weak. Jacob's eyes widened. It was a young woman, dressed in furs that were worn and patched, her dark hair falling in damp strands over her face. Her lips were pale, and her cheeks were streaked with snow and dirt. She collapsed onto the ground just a few feet from where Jacob had stopped. Without thinking, Jacob dropped to his knees beside her. "Hey, you're going to be okay," he said, his voice steady but gentle. He brushed the snow from her shoulders and carefully helped her sit up. She looked at him with wide, cautious eyes, and for a moment, neither spoke. The wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the cold that seemed to seep into every bone. Jacob realized that if she stayed out here, she would not survive the night. He lifted her gently, guiding her toward his horse, and helped her onto the saddle behind him. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The woman clutched at his waist, trembling, and Jacob could feel the weight of her exhaustion. He didn't ask questions yet. Survival came first. When they reached the cabin, Jacob helped her inside and laid her on a thick blanket near the fire. He added more wood to the flames, watching as the warmth slowly crept over her shivering form. For a few moments, he simply observed her, noting the fine features of her face and the steady rise and fall of her chest as she began to relax in the warmth. "Who are you?" he asked finally, keeping his voice calm. She hesitated, her dark eyes meeting his. "My name is Ayana," she said softly. I was traveling with my people, but the storm caught us. I got separated." Jacob nodded slowly. He had heard stories of travelers caught in early winter storms, but he had never expected to find one stranded on his own land. "You're safe now," he said. "You'll have to rest here until the storm passes. Then we can figure out your next steps." Ayana nodded, but her eyes still held a mixture of fear and wariness. He did not ask for food or water immediately, only curling into the blanket as the fire's warmth began to seep through her. Jacob realized that she had likely been on her own for hours, maybe days, and the exhaustion of survival had left her drained. He moved around the cabin checking the supplies. There was enough food for both of them, though Jacob had learned long ago to ration carefully during the winter. He prepared a simple meal of boiled potatoes and dried meat, setting a small plate near her side. "Eat when you're ready," he said, stepping back to give her space. She looked at the plate, then at him, and finally took a few small bites. The first signs of life returned to her eyes, and Jacob felt a quiet relief. As the evening wore on, the storm outside grew stronger. The wind whipped against the cabin walls, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. Snow drifted high, covering the paths and fence lines, isolating the cabin further. Jacob and Ayanna sat together near the fire, the silence between them filled with a crackle of flames. He did not press her for more details, sensing that trust would take time. Instead, he told her about life on the ranch, the routines, the animals, the long nights spent tending to the land. He spoke simply, without pretension, and Ayanna listened quietly, occasionally asking questions about the horses or the cabin. She shared small stories about her life as well, carefully chosen to reveal her strength and resourcefulness without giving away too much too soon. Jacob began to see her not just as a stranded traveler, but as someone capable of surviving hardships he could barely imagine. That night, Jacob prepared a bed for himself on the other side of the cabin, giving her the warmth of the blankets near the fire. He lay awake, listening to the storm, his mind turning over the day's events. The encounter had been unexpected, yet it had brought a spark of connection to his otherwise solitary life. He realized that, for the first time in many winters, he did not feel entirely alone. As dawn broke, the storm subsided slightly, and the sun reflected off the snow in dazzling white. Jacob looked at Ayanna still asleep, her face relaxed for the first time in days. He felt a quiet sense of responsibility and hope. The winter was harsh, and the land was unforgiving, but together, perhaps they could face it. Perhaps they could find strength in each other's presence. Jacob knew the coming days would test them both. The snow would continue to fall, the cold would bite, and the isolation would press down on their spirits. Yet, as he watched her rest, he felt the first stirrings of trust, the fragile beginnings of companionship that winter could not extinguish. For the first time in years, he imagined the possibility that this long, lonely season could hold more than survival. It could hold a chance for understanding, for friendship, for hope. And so, the first day passed quietly, with the cabin warm, the fire crackling, and the two strangers beginning a cautious journey toward trust. Outside, the plains remained white and silent, but inside, a small spark of life flickered, promising that the long winter might not be entirely without warmth. The morning after the storm, sunlight filtered weakly through the frost-covered windows of the cabin. Jacob had risen early, as was his habit, and was already moving quietly around the room. He tended the fire, stirred a pot of water for tea, and checked on the animals in the small barn nearby. Ayanna stirred on the bed, her dark hair spilling across the blanket, her face pale but calmer than the previous night. She watched Jacob with quiet curiosity, noticing how methodical and careful he was, even in the harsh winter cold. Jacob set a small cup of warm tea near her side. "Drink this," he said softly. "It will help warm you up." Ayanna took the cup cautiously, her fingers brushing the ceramic. She sipped slowly, savoring the warmth as it spread through her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. Jacob nodded without saying much else, letting the silence between them be comfortable rather than awkward. After breakfast, Jacob suggested they check the ranch together. Though Ayanna was still recovering her strength, she insisted on walking outside, bundling herself carefully in furs and blankets. The snow sparkled in the morning sun, and the wind was calmer than the day before. The air was crisp, filling their lungs with cold clarity. As they stepped into the open, Jacob guided her toward the barn, explaining the routines of feeding the animals and keeping the fences clear. Ayanna watched attentively, absorbing every detail. She asked questions about the cattle, the horses, and the tools Jacob used to care for the land. Her curiosity was genuine, and Jacob found himself answering patiently. Despite their differences, there was a shared understanding between them. Both had faced the harshness of nature in their own ways, and both knew that survival required attention, patience, and respect for the land. As the day went on, they worked side by side. Jacob taught Ayanna how to check the fences for breaks caused by the weight of snow and wind. She helped him repair a section where a post had snapped, using techniques her people had taught her for building shelters. He watched her carefully, impressed by her skill and calm determination. For her part, Ayanna admired Jacob's steadiness, the way he seemed to anticipate the land's needs without panic. Each recognized in the other a competence born of experience and hardship. By midday, they returned to the cabin for a simple meal of stew. The warmth of the fire and the food helped ease the fatigue that had settled into their bones from working in the cold. Ayanna began to speak more freely about her life, though always with caution. She told Jacob that she was traveling to reunite with her family who had remained in a Comanche village several miles away. She had been separated during a blizzard, losing sight of the group she had been traveling with. Jacob listened carefully, sensing the quiet fear in her voice beneath the calm exterior. "You're lucky the storm didn't catch you fully," he said, breaking the silence. "The plains are unforgiving in winter. A single night in that snow could be deadly." Ayanna nodded, her eyes reflecting the seriousness of his words. "I know," she said. "I have survived before, but this winter it is different. The cold is sharper, and the land feels empty." Jacob felt a pang of sympathy. He had known similar solitude, and he understood the weight of facing the elements alone. He poured himself another cup of tea and offered one to her again. They drank quietly, the silence filled with a sense of mutual understanding rather than discomfort. After the meal, Jacob suggested they spend the afternoon gathering firewood. Ayanna agreed, and they set out together, walking carefully through the snow. Jacob showed her where the best wood could be found, explaining how to identify branches strong enough to burn without collapsing. Ayanna moved confidently, her own knowledge of survival showing in the way she tested each branch before adding it to the bundle. They worked together efficiently, speaking only when necessary, letting the rhythm of the task guide them. As they carried the wood back to the cabin, Ayanna paused to look out over the plains. The snow stretched endlessly, a quiet white expanse broken only by distant trees and the occasional hill. She breathed deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs. "It is beautiful," she said softly, "but it is also lonely."
"I've never seen such a land."
Jacob nodded. "It can be harsh," he said, "but it has its own kind of life. You learn to listen to it, and it teaches you patience." Her eyes met his, and for a moment they shared a silent acknowledgement of their shared experiences. Both had faced hardship. Both had relied on their own strength to survive. And now, in the middle of winter, they had found each other, not as strangers in the cold, but as companions in the struggle to endure. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, they sat together by the fire. Ayanna had begun to recover her warmth and energy, and she helped Jacob with small tasks around the cabin. She repaired a torn blanket, swept the floor, and prepared a small meal for both of them. Jacob watched her quietly, noticing the care she took in each action. It was a subtle form of trust, a willingness to be present and contribute, and Jacob found himself appreciating it more than he could say. They spoke of their pasts in fragments, careful not to reveal too much at once. Ayanna told stories of her childhood, of learning to track and hunt, and of the lessons her people had taught her about respect for the land and animals. Jacob shared memories of his father, of working the ranch as a boy, and of the quiet satisfaction that came from tending to the animals and land through the long seasons. Each story built a bridge between them, creating a fragile connection strengthened by mutual respect. As night fell, a quiet snow began to drift again, dusting the landscape in fresh white. Jacob prepared their sleeping arrangements, making sure Ayanna was warm and comfortable near the fire. They settled into a routine. Long hours of silence and small talk during the day, tending to the animals in the cabin, and quiet reflection by the fire at night. The harshness of the winter made every small task significant, and every shared effort deepened their bond. In the days that followed, Jacob noticed subtle changes. Ayanna's confidence returned, her movements sure and steady. She began to anticipate needs around the cabin, fetching water before it was asked for, arranging the blankets to keep the warmth in, and quietly caring for the small animals in the barn. Jacob found himself relying on her presence, appreciating not just her skills but the comfort of companionship. Ayana, in turn, began to observe Jacob more closely. She saw the dedication in his eyes as he checked fences, the patience in his hands as he tended the horses, and the quiet strength in the way he faced cold and isolation. She realized that he had endured years of solitude, and yet he remained steadfast and capable. Her respect for him grew alongside the trust they were building. One afternoon, as the wind howled outside and the snow drifted high against the cabin walls, Jacob and Ayana sat by the fire, sharing a quiet meal. The warmth of the flames illuminated their faces, and for a moment, the harsh world outside seemed distant and muted. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. Both had experienced loss, hardship, and isolation, yet here together they found a small measure of peace. Ayana looked up at Jacob, her eyes thoughtful. "I have been alone for so long," she said softly. "I did not expect to find anyone who would care. Not in this winter, not in this place." Jacob met her gaze. "We survive by helping each other," he said simply, "even if only a little, even for a short time. That is enough to make the cold bearable." She nodded, a small smile forming. It was tentative but genuine. Jacob felt a quiet warmth in his chest, a feeling he had not experienced in years. It was more than survival. It was hope. The winter was still long, the land still harsh, but they had found a companion to face it with. And in that realization, the weight of solitude began to lift, replaced by a fragile, growing connection. As night deepened, they settled into bed near the fire. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the plains in quiet white. Inside, the cabin was warm, safe, and alive with the subtle energy of trust and companionship. Both Jacob and Ayana drifted to sleep with a sense of cautious optimism. The days ahead would not be easy. The winter was far from over, but they had learned that together they could endure more than they could alone. For the first time since the storm had brought them together, the two strangers felt that the long winter might not be just a season of cold and solitude. It could also be a time of learning, of understanding, and of hope. And as the fire crackled and the snow fell silently outside, a quiet promise hung in the air, that even in the harshest winter human connection could bring warmth, and that survival was only the beginning of something more. The next morning the sky was a pale gray, and the wind had picked up again. Snow fell in heavy flakes, covering the plains in a thick white blanket. Jacob knew the winter was far from over. He had learned to read the skies and anticipate storms, and this one promised to be fierce. The cold seemed sharper than the day before, cutting through even the thick layers of clothing. The animals were restless, and Jacob could sense that they too felt the change in the weather. Ayana stood near the doorway, wrapped in furs, her breath visible in the cold air. She had recovered her strength, but the relentless winter still tested her endurance. "It feels different today," she said softly, looking out at the snow-laden fields. "The storm is coming. We need to prepare. The wind can push snow into drifts that block paths and even collapse weak structures. We can't take chances." He began moving quickly around the cabin, checking the roof for loose shingles and securing the firewood pile. Ayana followed him, carrying smaller logs and helping wherever she could. Her hands moved with precision and care, and Jacob noticed how naturally she adapted to the tasks, even in the harsh conditions. By midday the storm had grown stronger. Snow whipped across the plains, reducing visibility to mere feet. Jacob and Ayana had gathered enough firewood and secured the cabin, but the isolation was already weighing on them. They could hear the wind howling like a living thing outside, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. The sound was constant and oppressive, leaving no space for rest or quiet reflection. Ayana watched Jacob carefully. "How long will it last?" she asked, her voice tense. "Could be a few days," Jacob replied. "Could be more. The winter is harsh here, and once a storm like this begins, it doesn't end quickly." They moved closer to the fire, the warmth providing a fragile shield against the cold that seeped through every crack. Jacob poured 2 cups of tea, handing one to Ayana. She sipped slowly, savoring the warmth. The storm outside seemed endless, and the cabin felt smaller, the walls closing in with each gust of wind. As the afternoon passed, tension began to rise. Supplies were limited, and the storm made any thought of leaving the cabin dangerous. Jacob checked the food and water carefully, noting how little remained. He knew that rationing would be necessary, and he also knew that Ayana might not yet fully understand how to survive in such isolation. He kept his thoughts to himself, focusing on maintaining calm. Ayana, for her part, grew restless. She was strong and used to traveling, and the confinement made her anxious. "We cannot just sit here," she said quietly. "We should try to check the animals or the fences." Jacob shook his head gently. "It's too dangerous. The storm is strong and you are not fully recovered. If we go out, we could get lost or worse. We stay here until it passes." Her eyes reflected frustration, but she nodded. She understood his reasoning, even if her pride bristled at being confined. She began to help in other ways, tending to the small animals in the cabin and preparing firewood. The hours were long, the storm relentless, and the silence between them was heavy with unspoken fear. As night fell, the storm intensified. Snow drifted against the cabin walls, piling high and threatening to block the door. The wind tore at the roof and windows, creating sharp, whistling sounds that made it difficult to sleep. Jacob and Ayana huddled near the fire, the only source of warmth and light in the otherwise dark and frozen world. A sudden crash outside made them both jump. Jacob grabbed his rifle and moved cautiously to the door, while Ayana clutched the blanket tightly around her. He opened the door just enough to peer out, and the sight that met him made his heart skip a beat. A large drift had collapsed part of the fence, leaving the animals vulnerable. Some of the cattle had wandered into a deeper snowbank, their heads barely visible above the drifts. "We have to get them," Jacob said urgently, turning back to Ayana. "We cannot let them freeze out there." Ayana nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "Then we do it together." They bundled themselves in extra layers, taking ropes and tools with them. The wind was fierce, and the snow stung their faces as they trudged through the drifts. Each step was a struggle, the snow often reaching their knees. Jacob led the way, breaking a path through the frozen landscape, while Ayana followed closely, her instincts guiding her in moving carefully and efficiently. They reached the cattle, finding several trapped in a deep snowbank. Jacob used the ropes to guide them out, while Ayana calmed the frightened animals, speaking to them softly in a steady voice. Together they worked with patience and determination, their movements synchronized despite the chaos of the storm. Hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of easing, yet they persisted. At one point, Ayana slipped on a hidden patch of ice, nearly falling into a drift. Jacob caught her quickly, steadying her with a firm grip. For a moment, their eyes met, and the unspoken trust between them grew stronger. They both realized that their survival depended not just on skill, but on their ability to rely on one another. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they managed to guide all the cattle to a sheltered area near the barn. Exhausted and frozen, they collapsed onto the snow for a moment, breathing heavily. The wind continued to howl, but the animals were safe, and the sense of relief was almost overwhelming. They returned to the cabin soaked and cold, and quickly stripped off wet layers to warm by the fire. Ayana's hands were red from exposure, and Jacob's face was pale, his eyes tired but alert. They shared a quiet meal, the simple act of eating feeling like a small victory after the day's trials. As they sat together, Ayana spoke softly. "I did not expect the winter to be this harsh," she said. "I have survived storms before, but nothing like this." Jacob nodded. "The land is unforgiving. It tests everyone who walks it. But you did well today. You helped save the animals, and you kept calm when it mattered." Her eyes softened. "I could not have done it without you." "I trust you." Those words, spoken quietly in the warmth of the cabin, carried more weight than any thanks. Jacob felt a deep sense of connection, a bond forged in struggle and shared effort. The storm outside continued, but inside there was a small light of hope that could not be extinguished by wind or snow. The following day the storm began to ease, though the land remained covered in deep snow. Jacob and Ayanna took the time to rest and recover, but both knew that winter's challenges were far from over. They spent the hours repairing the barn and checking on the animals, their movements careful and deliberate. The tasks, though physically demanding, brought a quiet rhythm to their days, and the companionship they shared became more natural. Jacob began to notice subtle changes in Ayanna. She smiled more often, her body language more relaxed. She shared small stories of her past, of her family and her people, giving Jacob glimpses into a world he had never known. He listened with patience, recognizing that trust was growing slowly, like a fire that needed tending. Ayanna, in turn, began to see Jacob in a new light. His quiet strength, his patience, and his willingness to protect and guide her impressed her deeply. She realized that this man, who had seemed distant and solitary, possessed a warmth and reliability that could be trusted in even the harshest conditions. As evening fell, they settled near the fire once more, the cabin filled with the gentle crackle of flames. Ayanna began to prepare a small meal, moving with care, while Jacob checked the supplies and ensured the fire would last through the night. They spoke quietly of small things, plans for the next day, observations about the land, stories of winter from their respective pasts. For the first time since the storm had begun, both felt a sense of calm and security. The bond that had started in the chaos of the blizzard and the effort to save the animals had grown into something more substantial. They were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were companions, relying on each other for both survival and emotional support. The night passed slowly, but without incident. The storm had tested their limits, and both had risen to the challenge. The experience left them exhausted, but also filled with a quiet confidence that they could face whatever came next. As they drifted to sleep near the fire, each reflected on the day's events, understanding that the harsh winter had brought them closer, teaching them lessons about resilience, trust, and the unexpected warmth of companionship. And though the storm still raged outside, Jacob and Ayanna knew that together they could endure it. The bond forged in the cold and snow was a promise of hope, a quiet assurance that even in the harshest conditions human connection could bring strength and comfort. Winter had tested them, but it had also revealed the beginning of something lasting. Trust, respect, and the fragile first spark of friendship and understanding that could survive any storm. The days after the storm brought a fragile calm to the plains. Snow still covered the land in thick white blankets, but the wind had softened, and sunlight reflected off the frozen fields. Jacob and Ayanna had spent the time repairing what had been damaged, checking the fences, and ensuring the animals were fed and sheltered. Despite the relative calm, the winter was far from forgiving. Every step outside was a struggle, and the land reminded them constantly that survival required attention, strength, and patience. Jacob woke early, as was his habit, and immediately checked the barn. Several cows were missing, likely pushed off by drifting snow and the weakened fence lines. He could see tracks leading into a distant gully, and the thought of venturing into the cold unsettled him. Yet leaving the animals in danger was not an option. He returned to the cabin, where Ayanna was already stirring, her furs wrapped tightly around her. "We need to find the missing cattle," Jacob said. "Some of them wandered off during the storm. We cannot leave them out there in this cold." Ayanna's eyes met his, steady and determined.
"Then we go together," she said. "I will help you."
"We are stronger if we work as one." They prepared carefully, bundling themselves in layers of clothing, gathering ropes, blankets, and food for the journey. The wind had calmed, but the snow still reached deep over much of the land. Each step was exhausting, the cold biting at their hands and faces. The world around them was a harsh white expanse, with only the occasional tree or hill to break the monotony. Jacob led the way, following the tracks he had seen from the barn. Ayanna moved closely behind, her keen eyes scanning the ground for any signs of the missing animals. She pointed out subtle tracks in the snow that Jacob might have missed, showing her skill and knowledge of nature's patterns. Together they navigated the frozen landscape with a quiet efficiency born of necessity. After several hours of trudging through the snow, they reached the gully. Several cows were trapped, unable to climb out due to deep snow and icy terrain. Jacob approached carefully, assessing the situation. One cow struggled near the edge, slipping on the ice and nearly falling back into the deep drift. Ayana moved quickly, speaking to it softly in a calm, steady voice, guiding it towards safer footing. Jacob grabbed the rope and secured it around the animal, helping to pull it to solid ground. They worked together tirelessly, moving from one trapped animal to another. The effort was exhausting, their muscles burning in the cold, yet neither complained. They shared small words of encouragement, a glance or a nod when one completed a task. The silence was punctuated by the occasional grunt or exclamation when a cow slipped or a rope tangled, but mostly it was the rhythm of shared labor that carried them forward. At one point Jacob slipped on an icy patch, falling hard onto the snow. Ayana reacted instantly, helping him up and steadying him. Their hands brushed briefly, and Jacob felt a sudden warmth that had nothing to do with the cold. Ayana's eyes met his, calm and focused, yet there was a flicker of something unspoken between them. He nodded silently, acknowledging the moment, but did not speak. Trust, he realized, had grown into something more profound, though neither had named it yet. By late afternoon they had rescued all the animals. Exhausted, frozen, and covered in snow, they turned toward the cabin. The journey back was slower, each step weighed down by fatigue and the heavy layers of clothing. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction in their movements, a sense of accomplishment that filled them both with warmth despite the cold. They had faced the harsh land together and emerged successful, their bond strengthened by shared struggle and determination. When they returned to the cabin, Jacob quickly stoked the fire, bringing warmth back into their bodies and their spirits. Ayana tended to the animals in the barn, ensuring they were fed and sheltered properly, while Jacob prepared a simple meal of boiled potatoes and meat. They ate quietly, the satisfaction of their labor mingling with a growing sense of companionship. As night fell, Jacob and Ayana sat together near the fire. Outside, the snow was falling lightly, dusting the world in quiet white. Inside, the cabin was filled with the warmth of the fire, the smell of food, and the subtle comfort of shared presence. They spoke quietly, their conversation turning to memories and reflections on their respective lives.
I have never been so far from my family, Ayana said softly, and yet I feel a strange comfort here.
You make the cold bearable, asked her, his eyes steady. It is easier when someone is with you. Even in winter, even when the land is harsh, it is easier when we share the burden. Her lips curved into a small smile. You have taught me patience. You have taught me that strength is not just in the hands, but in the heart as well. Jacob felt a warmth that had little to do with the fire. He had spent years alone, tending to the land and animals, but he had never experienced this connection. Ayana's presence, her quiet courage and skill had brought him something he had forgotten. He could feel companionship, trust, and hope. The following days were spent repairing fences and clearing paths through the snow. Jacob and Ayana moved together as a team, their actions instinctive and coordinated. They shared small victories. An animal saved, a fence mended, a path cleared, and each success deepened their bond. The harsh winter continued, but they faced it with a growing confidence, knowing that together they could overcome the challenges the land presented. One afternoon, while clearing snowdrifts near the barn, Jacob paused to rest. Ayana knelt beside him, offering a small piece of dried meat. We have done well today, she said. The animals are safe, and the cabin is secure. We are prepared for whatever comes next. Jacob nodded, accepting the food. Yes, but it is not just the work that matters. It is the way we face it together. That makes all the difference. Ayana's eyes met his, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The unspoken understanding between them was clear. They had faced the harshness of winter and survived, not just through skill and effort, but through trust, cooperation, and mutual respect. The storm had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and in the process, had revealed the strength of their connection. As evening fell, they returned to the cabin, exhausted but satisfied. The fire was warm, and the cabin smelled of food and wood smoke. They ate quietly, then settled near the fire, listening to the wind outside and feeling the warmth within. Jacob looked at Ayana and noticed the subtle changes. Her posture relaxed, her movements confident, her eyes filled with a quiet trust that had not been there when she first arrived. Ayana in turn observed Jacob. She saw the way he cared for the animals, the way he tended the cabin, the quiet strength in his hands and eyes. She realized that this man who had seemed so solitary and distant had a warmth and reliability that could be trusted in even the harshest conditions. That night, as they settled into their sleeping arrangements, the bond between them was undeniable. They had faced the storm together, rescued the animals, and survived the harsh winter. They had relied on each other, learned from each other, and come to respect and trust one another deeply. The cabin was warm, the fire crackled softly, and for the first time the winter did not feel quite so cold or endless. Jacob lay awake for a while, thinking of the events of the day. He reflected on the trust he had placed in Ayana, the skill and courage she had shown, and the quiet companionship that had grown between them. The winter was still long, the plains still harsh, but he felt a new sense of hope. He realized that survival was not just about enduring the cold and snow. It was about finding connection, relying on another person, and discovering strength in partnership. Ayana, too, lay awake, thinking of Jacob and the days they had shared. She had come to the cabin seeking shelter and safety, but she had found something more. A companion, a trusted ally, someone who had shown her that even in the harshest winter, human connection could bring warmth and hope. She realized that their bond had become something meaningful, something that could survive the cold, isolation, and challenges of the plains. The night passed quietly. The wind outside softened, and the snow fell gently on the plains. Inside, Jacob and Ayana slept, their hearts lighter, their connection stronger, and their hope for the future quietly growing. Winter had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and revealed the depth of their resilience and trust. And as the cabin glowed with firelight, the two companions rested, ready to face whatever challenges the remaining season would bring. The emotional weight of the storm and the shared labor had changed them both. They were no longer strangers forced together by circumstance. They were partners in survival, companions in hardship, and most importantly, human beings who had found in each other a sense of belonging, trust, and quiet hope. The harsh winter had brought them together, and their connection was now a source of strength that neither could ignore. Even as the days ahead promised more snow and cold, Jacob and Ayana felt prepared. Together they had faced the storm, saved the animals, and endured the harsh land. And together they knew they could face whatever came next, not just as individuals but as companions, united by experience, respect, and an unspoken understanding that winter, no matter how long or cruel, could not freeze the warmth that had begun to grow between them. The days following the storm brought a quiet sense of renewal to the plains. The heavy snow that had blanketed the land now glistened under the pale sunlight, sparkling like a field of diamonds. Though the winter was far from over, the harshest part of the storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that was almost peaceful. Jacob and Ayana had spent the past few days repairing what had been damaged, checking the animals and clearing paths through the snow. Each task, though exhausting, was made lighter by their shared presence and growing trust. Jacob rose early, as was his habit, and walked to the barn to check on the animals. The cattle were calm, huddled together for warmth, and the horses grazed slowly on the limited hay available. The storm had left them weak, but alive. Jacob felt a quiet relief and pride, knowing that together he and Ayana had managed to protect them. He walked back to the cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots, and found Ayana already awake by the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. "Good morning," she said softly, smiling. Her eyes carried a calm assurance, a reflection of the resilience that Jacob had come to admire. "Morning," Jacob replied, returning her smile. "The animals are safe. We did well." Ayana nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting in a small, contented expression. "We did well together," she said. Her words struck a chord in Jacob. The phrase was simple, but it carried weight. It acknowledged not just the work they had done, but the partnership that had formed between them. He realized that the long winter had changed more than the land. It had changed them. They had learned to rely on each other, to trust one another, and to find comfort in shared effort and quiet companionship. That morning they decided to venture further than they had in days, checking the fences that stretched across the farthest reaches of the ranch. The snow was still deep, but the air was crisp and clear, and the sun cast long shadows across the frozen fields. Jacob led the way, breaking a path through the snow, while Ayanna followed closely, her eyes scanning for anything that might be damaged or hidden beneath the drifts. As they worked, they shared stories of their pasts. Ayanna spoke of her childhood in the Comanche community, of the lessons her elders had taught her about the land, the animals, and the importance of patience and observation. She explained how she had learned to read signs in nature, the tracks of animals, the changes in wind and snow, and the patterns of the seasons. Jacob listened attentively, fascinated by the depth of knowledge she carried. In turn, Jacob shared memories of his father and the ranch. He told Ayanna about the long winters he had faced alone, the nights spent tending fires and repairing fences, and the quiet satisfaction that came from caring for the land and animals. He spoke without embellishment, simply recounting the life he had lived. Ayanna listened with interest, appreciating his honesty and the strength he had shown in solitude. By midday they had completed their inspection of the far fences. Jacob paused on a small rise looking out over the plains. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the distant trees and hills. Ayanna stood beside him, her face turned toward the sun, and for a moment they shared a quiet silence, taking in the vastness of the land and the calm after the storm. "It is beautiful," Ayanna said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Even after all the cold and hardship, there is life here. There is hope." Jacob nodded. "Yes," he agreed. "The land is harsh, but it gives back if you care for it. Just as we have learned to care for each other." Her eyes met his, and he felt a warmth that had little to do with the sun. The winter had tested them, challenged them, and forced them to rely on one another. Through the storms, the cold, and the isolation, they had formed a bond that neither could ignore. It was quiet, steady, and resilient, like the land itself. Ayanna worked with ease, tending the fire and arranging the food, while Jacob handled the larger tasks of chopping wood and checking supplies. The rhythm of their work was natural, a reflection of the partnership that had grown between them over the past weeks. After the meal, they sat near the fire, warming themselves and sharing small observations about the land. The snow had begun to melt slightly in the sunlight, revealing patches of brown earth beneath. Birds, long absent during the storm, began to return, calling softly in the distance. The world outside seemed to be waking up again, and both Jacob and Ayanna felt a quiet sense of renewal. "I have learned much from you," Ayanna said after a while, her eyes focused on the fire. "Not just about survival, but about patience, trust, and strength. You have shown me that one can endure hardship and still find hope."
Jacob looked at her, moved by the sincerity in her voice. "And I have learned from you," he replied.
"You have reminded me that strength is not just in being alone, but in sharing the burden, in trusting someone else, even when the world is harsh and cold." They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the crackle of the fire and the wind outside. The storm had passed, but the winter remained a reminder of the challenges they had faced and the resilience they had discovered within themselves and in each other. As evening approached, Jacob and Ayanna prepared for the night. The snow outside glowed softly in the moonlight, and the cabin was warm and safe. They settled near the fire, the quiet comfort of shared presence wrapping around them like a blanket. Jacob reflected on the weeks that had passed, the storm, the challenges, the long hours spent tending the land, and the quiet moments of connection that had grown into trust and companionship. Ayanna, too, reflected on their journey. She thought of the harsh winter, the isolation, and the moments when fear had threatened to take hold. And she thought of Jacob, steady and reliable, guiding her, protecting her, and trusting her in turn. She realized that their bond had become something lasting, something that could survive not just the cold and snow, but any hardship that life might bring. The night passed quietly, and the first light of dawn revealed a world transformed. Snow melted slightly under the gentle sun, birds sang softly, and the plains seemed alive with possibility. Jacob and Ayana stepped outside, feeling the crisp air on their faces, and looked out over the land. The winter had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and shown them their own strength. But it had also revealed the power of connection, trust, and shared purpose. They walked together across the plains, checking the animals and ensuring the ranch was secure. Each step was lighter than before, the burden of isolation lifted by companionship and understanding. The world was still cold, the snow still deep, but the harshness was tempered by the bond that had grown between them. That evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Jacob and Ayana stood together on a small rise, looking out over the plains. The land stretched endlessly before them, a mixture of snow, earth, and distant trees. They felt a sense of accomplishment, not just in surviving the storm, but in the growth they had experienced together. "You have made this winter bearable," Jacob said quietly, his voice sincere. "And you have given me hope," Ayana replied, her eyes meeting his. "Hope that even in the coldest, harshest places connection and trust can bring warmth." They stood in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. The winter had been long and challenging, but it had also brought them together, revealing the strength of human resilience and the quiet power of companionship. The harsh plains had taught them patience, courage, and trust, and in return they had discovered a bond that would endure beyond the season. As night fell, they returned to the cabin, their hearts light and spirits renewed. They tended the fire, prepared a simple meal, and shared quiet conversation, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. The snow fell softly outside, covering the land in white, but inside the cabin, warmth and hope prevailed. Jacob and Ayana settled into bed, feeling a sense of peace and satisfaction. The winter had tested them in every way, yet they had endured, not just as individuals, but as companions. They had faced hardship, danger, and isolation, and in doing so had discovered the power of trust, respect, and shared effort. As they drifted to sleep, the fire crackled softly, and the world outside lay quiet and still. The storm had passed, the snow had settled, and the plains were calm. Inside the cabin, 2 lives had been transformed by circumstance, survival, and the quiet, steady bond that had grown between them. Winter had been harsh, but it had also been a season of hope, connection, and resilience. In the weeks that followed, the snow continued to fall in lighter flurries, but the land was no longer oppressive. Jacob and Ayana continued their work on the ranch, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and clearing paths. They moved as a team, their actions coordinated and instinctive, each supporting the other in ways both small and significant. Their connection deepened, no longer fragile but steady and enduring. The story closed with a scene on a quiet evening, Jacob and Ayana standing together on a rise overlooking the plains. The snow glimmered under the fading sunlight. The wind carried a softer promise of spring, and the land seemed alive with possibility. Together they had faced the harshest winter, survived the storms, and discovered something far more valuable than mere survival: trust, companionship, and hope for the future. Winter had brought them together. The land had tested them, but through it all, they had found warmth, connection, and a bond that could withstand any challenge. And as the fire burned softly in the cabin behind him, Jacob and Ayana knew that the season of solitude had ended, not with cold or isolation, but with understanding, resilience, and the quiet joy of shared hope.